From then on, it was mostly more smooth sailing, with Burke calmly explaining the parts of the human head and their various functions, with little reaction from the crowd other than the customary nods and writing of notes. However, it was when he made it to the mouth that things actually got interesting. Moving on to the oral cavity, also known as the mouth, which, as you can see, takes up a significant portion of the lower half of the face, he said. It's comprised of a tongue to taste food, teeth to chew it, and specialized glands, which release saliva, the acidic properties of which help soften up food until it is swallowed, and then. Question. What? Burke exclaimed, his surprised response the result of the fact that he hadn't expected anyone to ask questions before or after the presentation. But here someone was, and doing it while he was talking no less. Something that the professor was sure wasn't proper etiquette in such a professional space. But still, someone had a query, and it was his job to answer. So he pointed toward the general direction of the voice and nodded. Yes. What's your question? I'm very sorry for interrupting, but I just wanted to ensure I heard you correctly. The alien asked, a short blue-furred being with what was clearly a bewildered expression plastered on their face. Did you say that your species' saliva has acidic properties? Yes, it does. Approximately a 6.7 on our pH scale, which would translate to a 40 or so on your community's acid scale. Burke guessed, which was followed by several shocked whispers and murmurs. He gulped and wondered if he had said the wrong thing. But when Burke looked over to Bren for support, he looked just as lost as everyone else, further increasing his panic. I'm sorry, did I say the wrong thing? Or is this trait not a common one among sentient species? You didn't say the wrong thing, no. But it's not a trait found in any species we know of. For that matter, the level of acidity isn't that high, but its mere presence is of great surprise to us. The alien replied, and Burke couldn't help but raise an eyebrow. Again, apologies for my interruption. It's just that it has been eons since we've seen such a noticeable difference in a new species' internal systems. Weak as it may be, an acid that's naturally produced in an organism's body is completely unheard of. Okay. Was all Burke managed to say before he straightened himself. In that case, I'm glad that we have something new to introduce to the scientific community. We can discuss more about it once this section of the presentation is done, and I'll answer all the questions you have. And from that point forward, the professor simply went back to casually explaining humanity's many biological functions, bringing up diagrams of the esophagus and then the heart and lungs, with a few more slides. But Burke could feel it. Something in the room had changed, and all of a sudden, everyone there was paying attention to the presentation as if their lives depended on it. Clearly, they were waiting for another ground-shattering revelation about human biology. And Burke wondered just how long it had been since they truly discovered something new, like that blue one had said. Eons. Which also brought up the question of how long the audience members had lived. But that was a discussion for later. As for right now, he just focused on delivering the facts as best he could, pointing out the many parts of the lungs and heart with newfound eagerness. Not just because his viewers were much more attentive, but because of what organ he would get to explain next. The alien claimed that no sentient species had acid in their saliva, and the professor had formed a theory from that alone. About how human bodies might have a small but very special difference when it came to other sentients. And if that theory turned out to be correct, then he couldn't wait to see their reactions to the next couple of slides. And thus, the heart and lungs are generally accepted to be the most vital organs after the brain. He continued, briefly glancing over at Bren before clicking to the next slide. Now, moving on, this is the main organ of the digestive system, the stomach. As mentioned previously, the softened food from the mouth is sent into this chamber, upon which it rapidly releases digestive enzymes from the walls. This acrid liquid is composed primarily of things like hydrochloric acid to break down food, so any nutrients can be absorbed, as well as many other compounds that serve various purposes. It was at this moment that Burke gleefully took a moment to pause to see if his theory was true, and frankly, it was hard to tell at first. On one hand, nobody was saying anything or whispering, but on the other, it was dead quiet and he couldn't even hear the sound of breathing from the various researchers. It was as if the entire room had suddenly become a vacuum, and every single person there was waiting for something to break the silence. "Ah," a voice from the front row finally said, a tall and thin alien that looked vaguely tree-esque. "Professor Burke, while we like to be lenient when it comes to how information is presented in this space, we do ask you to not joke around or tell blatant lies. It will distract us from the truth." "Oh, this is going to be delicious. No pun intended," Burke thought, trying not to smile as he clasped his hands together. "Oh, well, I'm sorry if you're under the impression that I'm joking. But none of what I'm telling you is a lie. Everything you see on this slide and what I just said is the truth, simple as that." The sudden and insane cacophony of whispers that exploded from the audience was everything Burke could have hoped for. He stopped talking immediately and turned towards the crowd, slightly worried that he wouldn't be able to use the "save the questions for the end" excuse again. He casually peeked at Bren for the 100th time, but his assistant was looking at him with a very obvious, "what the hell" expression. And it took all of 5 seconds for the alien to walk over to Burke and whisper in his ear, "I'm going to make this as quick as possible. But please tell me that you are not lying in the slightest, and everything you're saying is the truth. Because if this is a joke, then you've taken it too far. I'm not lying in the slightest, and everything I'm saying is the truth." "Damn," was all Bren responded with as he went back to the side of the stage, all of their eyes now wider than dinner plates. Burke took this reaction as a good sign and turned back to the audience as he prepared to let loose. "I sense that I may have some questions regarding previous information. Is there anything someone would like to ask?" Almost instantly a dozen hands shot up from the crowd, the vast majority of which didn't even wait for Burke to call on them to answer questions. He couldn't help but laugh to himself at how familiar this all felt. Back when he was still a university professor and was teaching a concept that none of his students understood. "Okay, one at a time, please," he requested, and most of the audience politely quieted down. "Ah, you first," he said to the same blue-furred one from earlier. "What's your question?" "When you said your species' stomach excretes acids in the digestion process, is that meant literally, or is it some kind of saying or metaphor?" the creature asked, clearly wishing for it to be the latter. "As I, and I'm sure the rest of my colleagues, would like to ensure for the final time that what you're saying is what truly happens." "All completely literal," Burke replied. "Although, before I can continue, may I please inquire as to why this information is such a shock?" "I understand. It is not customary for the presenter to be the one asking questions. But I feel as if I am missing some context. Because as pointed out beforehand, no species in this room or across the entire galaxy can produce natural acid inside their bodies. And we're all wondering how it's possible that yours can," Bren interjected, taking center stage and making sure to project his voice. "Almost all creatures' digestion works by the food in the stomach being sliced to pieces by thousands of tiny but incredibly sharp denticles located inside the organ, with all solid remains being pushed into any lower systems. But you claim that yours contains acid and it just melts, dissolves. What term do you use?" "Both of those would work just fine," Burke said, although he was personally intrigued by what Bren said about the denticles and how different their internal structures were. He would have to ask more about that later. "But all in all, yes. That is exactly how it works. However, before anyone asks anything else, how about this? I'll simply continue the part of the presentation about the human digestive system, and when I'm done, you can query me to your heart's content. Once that is finished, we will simply continue on to the rest of the body, right on schedule." He took a deep but steady breath. "Is this acceptable to my listeners? I understand your surprise now, but it would be much more efficient for me to explain the full process without interruptions than just answering questions one by one." "Well, I don't suppose any of us are going to argue against that," Bren admitted, which was agreed upon by a collective murmur from every corner of the room. "But please be careful," he continued, the alien's voice now so low, only he and the human could hear it. "I don't know if this seems like a big deal to you, but it is to them, and I don't know what will happen once this is all over. If what you're saying is all true, then things may get complicated." "Complicated in what regard?" "Like wanting to perform an actual vivisection on a member of your species, all ethics be damned," Bren replied, and his tone of voice was suddenly dead serious. Burke gulped and nodded in response, flushing the thought from his mind as he tried not to think about any of those implications. He turned his focus back to the screen, his previously dead tone of voice now replaced by a much more enthusiastic one. "Moving on to the more complex functions of the digestive system then," he continued, as if nothing had happened. From that point forward, it was the same endless parade of facts being spouted from Burke's mouth, with, of course, his viewers now utterly enthralled by what he was saying, even more so than a minute ago. Each description made them write down notes that seemed to take up an entire page. And every mention of the word acid causes their eyes to twitch, like their brains couldn't process what they were hearing. And yes, even though Bren's little vivisection comment was hanging over his head like a guillotine, the professor couldn't deny that he was still loving every moment of this. His favorite thing to do in the world was teach. And even though he was stuck with PowerPoint, the human knew full well that this was the highlight of his career and likely his entire life. And after that, any waste products are excreted out. And that is the full cycle of the digestive system. Burke finished, having made sure to go into as little detail as possible, so there would be plenty of juicy questions. Their reactions had been the best part after all. "Now, I assume that there are questions. And this time, please." "Yes, I have one." "Me as well." "Excuse me, but I ask the human first." "Ask one at a time, okay." Burke sighed, putting his hands behind his back before nodding towards a person in the second row. One who looked like a blanket of fur, with a pair of eyeballs sticking out. "You, in the second row. What would you like to ask?" "How is any of this biologically possible?" they demanded, but before Burke could even open his mouth to answer, the alien's colleagues were on him like pigeons. "What kind of question is that? He just explained it all to us," one scoffed. "Well, isn't part of the process always double-checking? I just want to ensure that we know all the details," the furred one responded. "And don't tell me that my question is foolish because the last one." "Please, settle down. You'll all get a chance to ask. We have hours of time," Burke reminded them, holding his hands up as he felt his heart rate increase. "As for your question, I will admit that I simply cannot give a clear answer. It is just the way that humans evolved. No genetic tampering, no artificial evolution. Nothing else to it really." "Incredible," the furred one mused before looking down at its notes and frantically typing. The professor then turned to another raised hand and pointed, this time choosing something that resembled a mix between a deer and a tiger. "Yes, you in the back. The acid in your species is digestive organs. What prevents it from eating through your own tissue? You mentioned it is lethal enough to damage bone. So how can it possibly perform its function, but not harm you in the process?" it queried. And judging by the collective whispers from around it, the vast majority of the audience wished to know this as well. Simple. A layer of thickened mucus on the walls prevents that, along with a chemical in the acids themselves, called bicarbonate. It ensures that the acidity levels aren't too dangerous and also protects the lower digestive tract from being burned by the enzymes. Burke explained, and the alien paused before leaning forward, the sound being like a rusty gate swinging open. So you're telling us that not only does your species' stomach somehow produce natural acid, but another chemical that ensures you won't be killed by your body's own automatic processes? Yes, Burke said bluntly, causing the creature to turn to its notes just like the last one. Now, on to the third question, you right there, in the back, he continued, gesturing towards an alien whose body was somewhat transparent. The creature's arm looked like a blob of water suspended in midair, and Burke couldn't help but briefly marvel at the appearance of the creature. I presume you have something to ask regarding all this as well. The author's name and the link to original text is in the description. Consider tapping the thumbs up and pressing the subscribe button if you want to listen to the subsequent parts of this story.